Hello, well, it's Sunday again, and it's time for the Good Reasons to Believe show. I'm your host, Alan Darley, and today I wanted to discuss the intriguing question, what is the reason for reason? A good title, perhaps, for the Good Reasons show. So the plan is I'm going to speak for about 20 minutes or so, and then I'll try and respond to any questions or comments that you have as a live audience today. I wonder if you've ever played the game when you were younger of asking the question why to any answer that someone gives you to your question. A few years ago, my neighbour's child used to like playing this game. She would come around on my doorstep and say, do you live here? And I would say yes, and she would say, why? And then she would say, does your mummy live here? And I would say no. And she'd say, why? And I'd say, because she lives in Lincoln. And she'd say, why? And so on and so on. She used to have a little Arab boyfriend, I remember, who was about 2, and she used to push him over, and he used to live next door as well. So a cute little girl with a funny game. But this raises the absurdity, doesn't it, of an infinite chain of explanations. In philosophy, this is called an infinite regress, where you have an infinite sequence of reasons for something. And it would leave the question, if that was the case, if there was an infinite amount of reasons for, say, existence itself, how you would explain that chain itself. What is the explanation of the chain of reasons? Does it just hang there like a chain with nothing to hang it from? I want to argue today that there's only 2 possible ways out of an infinite regress. And that is, by number 1, by saying that the first reason has no reason at all, or by saying that the first reason is a self-explanatory and necessary reason. A few years ago, Richard Dawkins said in a lecture at the Edinburgh Science Festival, faith is the great cop-out, he said, the great excuse to evade the need to think and evaluate evidence. Faith is the belief in spite of, even perhaps because of, the lack of evidence. And Dawkins and many other new atheists have condemned faith as the great unthinking activity, which should be opposed by free rational thinkers. But my question to them is that if atheism is true, then what is the reason for reason? And is it rational to say that there's no ultimate reason for anything? Because it seems to me that atheism is forced, in order to avoid the infinite regress that we've just talked about, is forced into saying that the first reason has no reason. Why is that? Well, on atheism, there is no mind that exists before evolution throws up higher mammals with the capacity to think. And that's very recent in the evolutionary timeline. And therefore, there's no reason in nature before that. But if Christianity is true, if theism is true, then I'm hoping to convince you today that the Christian faith is supremely rational, because it gives us a good reason for reason. A good reason for reason. It gives us a good explanation for why there is an explanation. And that explanation is explanation itself with a capital E. This agrees with what is written in John chapter 1, verse 1, which reads, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." So here we see on the Christian position that the beginning of everything was not silence, was not non-reason, and was not nothingness, but was in the Greek logos. Logos means word. It also means, it carries a connotation of reason, meaning, or explanation. So another way of saying this is that God is reason, capital R, itself. God is reason itself. I don't mean by that we should worship human reason, which did happen in the French Revolution after they threw off the aristocracy, the kings, and also organized religion. They still ended up worshipping something. They worshipped a goddess of reason who they symbolically portrayed riding into the city. I'm not talking about that, but I'm talking about God being the source of human reason. What we call reason in our experience is, on the Christian view, just a participation, if you like, a sharing in the supreme reason, which is God himself. Two first principles of logic, of human reasoning, are, number one, the law of identity, which is A equals A. Alan Darley is Alan Darley. The laptop is the laptop. The law of identity. This is the first, and we can't have any kind of reason without assuming that. The second principle is the law of non-contradiction, that something can't both be and not be at the same time and in the same way. Aristotle talked about these two principles. But we can see that both of these are founded on the Christian view. There's a real reason for these principles on the Christian view. On the one who calls himself I am, that I am. This is a name which God gives himself when he reveals himself to Moses in the book of Exodus chapter 3 verse 14. A mysterious name which translates into the Hebrew Yahweh. So God is the self-existent one. I am that I am. He cannot not be, and he cannot deny himself. It is impossible for God to lie because he is the truth itself. When God speaks, he is absolutely equal to his own word, and he is therefore absolutely trustworthy. I want to bring in here some excellent points that were made in a famous debate in 1948 on BBC Radio between the Jesuit priest F.C. Copleston and his more famous opponent, the agnostic and the skeptic Bertrand Russell. I find it quite amusing to listen to. You can listen to it on YouTube, about an 18-minute clip of it. Their voices sound like very posh 1940s accents. They sound a bit like Spike Milligan on the Goon Show or something. So I recommend tuning into that. But Copleston there uses as his central argument for the existence of God an argument called the argument from contingency, which I'm going to unpack in a moment. This was an argument that he had adapted from the so-called third way of proving God's existence from Thomas Aquinas, with the Leibniz's principle of sufficient reason. He conflated those two ideas together, and his argument goes something like this. I hope you'll follow it, because some of the language is technical, but I'll try and simplify it. So, number one, some contingent beings exist. The contingent being means a being that depends on something else to exist, and Copleston defines it as a being that depends on another being to explain its existence. So we know that things exist which can't be explained by themselves. They need something else to explain them. An example would be me, right? How do I explain myself? I explain myself because I had parents who got together and gave birth to me. And this is the case for anything in our experience, everything we experience has a reason for its existence outside of itself. Now, the word universe is only a collective noun of beings which need something else to explain them. The universe is a collection of contingent beings. So if there were no contingent beings, there would be no universe either. In the same way that a herd of sheep would cease to exist if there were no sheep. Now, if the universe is a collection, number 3, if the universe is a collection of particular contingent beings, then even if this went on to infinity, there will be no explanation for the infinite chain itself, because the infinite chain would not exist without the particular contingent beings of which it is made up. I hope you're still following me. Number 4, therefore, we must either say that the universe of contingent beings has no explanation, which is, when you think about it, that's irrational. Irrational means without reason. It's also unscientific, because science tries to find a reason for things. So if we say the universe has no ultimate explanation, then we're being irrational and unscientific. The alternative is to say that there is a being that has an explanation for its own existence within itself, a being which is self-explanatory. Is such a being possible? That's what we'll have to decide, but this is the only alternative to saying that the universe is without explanation. Now, only a necessary being, a being that cannot not be, only such a being can have an explanation for its own existence within itself, because he is his own existence. His existence and his essence are the same. And this necessary being is what we mean by the word God. So there's the argument. And I'm going to be welcoming questions and comments at the end of this short presentation, so please be texting them in. At the end of this debate, Bertrand Russell asserted that the idea of a necessary being was meaningless. He thought that it was literally meaningless. He thought only ideas are necessary, that beings are not necessary. And as a result, the discussion had to end because it was just reached a stalemate. However, Russell was forced to admit during the debate that if there is no God, then the universe is just there, and that is all. That's a quote from his debate. The universe is just there, and that is all, without explanation. Now, you might say, well, why does that matter? Why couldn't that be the case? Well, it does matter if you're one of those people claiming to be a rational thinker. If you're one of those people claiming that naturalism is true because it is the most reasonable way of looking at the world, the best explanation of looking at the world, how can it be the best explanation of looking at the world if it's saying that this explanation has no explanation? Surely this undermines reason itself. How can an effect rise greater than its cause? How can reason come from non-reason? If that were the case, what we mean by the word reason would be just some kind of useful fiction, as Daniel Vecchio terms it, with no meaning, with no literal meaning. So the stark choice we are left with, I put it to you, is this: either the universe is pointless or God exists. Even Alex Rosenberg, who yesterday engaged in a fantastic debate, and I do recommend listening to this debate on the Reasonable Faith website with William Lane Craig. Rosenberg is, according to one website, considered the 13th most famous atheist in the world. Perhaps he's more famous now as a result of his debate yesterday. William Lane Craig quoted Rosenberg in one of his books as making the statement, quote, "We need to face the fact that nihilism is true." Nihilism is a belief that the universe is pointless. I think Rosenberg is correct on atheism. The only explanation for the universe is that it is pointless, i.e. that there's no explanation. By the way, Craig, in a phone-in vote, won the debate. Now, you might object to my reasoning so far and say, hang on a minute, why can't the universe itself be self-explanatory? If you're saying that the chain must stop somewhere, why does it have to stop with God? Why can't it stop with the universe itself? And why can't the universe explain itself? Well, we've already seen, if we backtrack a little bit, we've already seen that the universe cannot explain itself because the universe is contingent. The name universe is a collective noun for particular beings, all of which are contingent. If these particular beings didn't exist, there would be no universe. And none of these particular beings has an explanation for its own existence within itself. Therefore, it doesn't matter how many of those particular beings you have, even if it goes on to infinity, those particular beings cannot explain themselves, and that chain of explanations cannot explain itself either. Furthermore, science backs up this assertion that the universe is contingent, because the best science today in cosmology supports the position that the universe had a beginning. The Borde-Guth-Vilenkin theorem gives very strong evidence that any universe must have an absolute beginning, and this includes the so-called multiverse theory. It includes the eternal inflation, cyclic evolution, and emergent universe models. The Borde-Guth-Vilenkin theorem shows that even if these universes go on forever, they had a beginning, a finite, absolute beginning in time. Now, anything that has a beginning must have an explanation outside of itself. Nothing can be uncaused without explanation. The atheist philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre chose the option that there is no reason for reason. He claimed in his famous book, Being and Nothingness, in the 1960s, he claimed that since the universe is grounded literally on nothing, then nothing has any intrinsic essence or nature to it, including a human being. Existence precedes essence, he said, and therefore you are free. Romantically, you can make this leap, he thought, to be anything you want to be, which of course is false. Here's a quote from his book, Being and Nothingness. Uncreated, without reason for being, without any connection with another being in itself, by which he means human beings, is superfluous for eternity. Superfluous for eternity. According to Sartre, it is bad faith to pretend that you have any sort of fixed nature. But note, this view that reason is founded on non-reason, that reason is founded on nothingness, is fatal, absolutely fatal for science. It's important to note that Charles Darwin did not believe that. In his Origin of Species, he says, quite categorically, quote, I cannot persuade myself that electricity acts, that the tree grows, that man aspires to the loftiest conceptions, all from blind brute force. He did not believe in irrationality governing the universe. But today there is a move in science away from this realist interpretation that Darwin had, that the first scientists had, those who birthed the modern scientific method. There's a movement away from realism to pragmatism. There's the attitude amongst many scientists today, why care about truth as long as it works, as long as it benefits the economy, as long as it benefits the multinational companies who sponsor my research. Now, when this happens, science qua science is dead. And we should never allow the atheist the luxury of claiming that science supports atheism. On the contrary, atheism destroys science because there is no basis for the intelligibility of nature in itself. If God is dead, science is also dead. On the atheist view, reason is only something which is developed, which has been thrown up blindly, relatively recently, on the evolutionary timescale in higher mammals. It has no meaning. It only has a function to help us reproduce and survive. This is ultra-Darwinism, which Darwin didn't believe, by the way. But the atheist Darwinists have to follow in order to be intellectually fulfilled, so they say. Moreover, the universe was unintelligible before humans appeared to make sense of it. And yet, in order for science to be science and not something like modern art, science cannot create truth. If it created truth, it would be like modern art. It's just making something up subjectively. Science is about discovering truth. But how can it discover truth if there's not already truth and intelligibility built into the structure of nature itself? To rephrase Aristotle, and we need to go back to Aristotle on this. He said art imitates nature. By art, he meant any human skill. So we could say science imitates nature. Science is a teleological exercise. Teleological means it's geared towards an end, towards a goal. What is the goal of science? The goal of science is to discover truth about nature. But it can only have that goal if there's already a telos, if there's already an end or a purpose in nature itself. If there wasn't already a meaning in nature itself, how could human beings possibly ever create it? Did they omnipotently create reason out of nothing? Human beings are part of nature. They are the product of nature. How can they, as the effect, produce out of nothing objective reason, meaning, truth? Science. Another example that fascinates me is colour. What is colour? Colour can only exist for conscious beings. Colour is a subjective awareness of light particles. If there was no one to look at them, there would just be particles. But what is the point of a beautiful world infused with colour, with no one to look at it? Why is there such a universe infused with, saturated with beauty, as Tennant said, with no one to perceive it? I'd like to call this the argument from Louis Armstrong. I see trees of green, red roses too. I see them bloom for me and you, and I say to myself, what a wonderful world. It looks like colour was created by consciousness and for consciousness. So I find it amazing, really. I find it amazing that many intellectual people balk at this, object to this. I think because they see where it's going. They see the implications of this. And none of us is without a vested interest in the answer to these questions. Sometimes the truth is inconvenient. It is surely, as there's a comment coming through, and I'll just have to take that in a sec because I'm on a different page. I've nearly finished. I find it amazing that many intellectual people object to this, because surely it is irrational to deny the rational. Hegel once said, the rational is the real. As well as colour, I'd like to mention the example of mathematics. Modern cosmologists, such as Stephen Hawking, Paul Davies, Vilenkin, have demonstrated they work all the time with mathematics. They've shown that the universe is built on mathematics. How then could mathematics be a human construct? How could it be something imposed on nature arbitrarily by human beings? Why would it work? Why would we be able to make predictions to precise accuracy if mathematics was just coincidentally fitted with nature, or was something arbitrary and made up by human beings? Mathematics is not something human beings have invented. It is something in the structure of reality. It's an intelligible and rational reality. Antony Flew was somebody who had the honesty to live by the principle, follow the argument wherever it leads. This was a principle that goes back to Socrates in ancient Greece. Follow the argument where it leads. And he had the honesty to follow that, even though for 50 years he had written books and articles defending atheism. He was the one who wrote the article on the presumption of atheism, which many atheists now use as part of their burden of proof argument, for example. A very influential atheist. But he, at the end of his life, abandoned atheism. One of his main reasons was he could not explain the laws of physics themselves. He couldn't explain the rationality in the universe itself, the laws of physics. And he wrote a book. His final book was There Is a God, 2008. Check it out. There Is a God, 2008. Some people tried to discredit Flew and say, oh, he's about to pop his clogs. He's scared of death. He's just trying to make his peace with God, hedge his bets before he dies. But this was false, because Flew, even though he converted from atheism, still did not believe in life after death. He became a deist. He didn't believe in miracles. He didn't believe in bodily survival. He didn't believe in survival after death. So there was no vested interest in that. He was following the argument where it led. Another intellectual giant who I always come back to because he's one of my heroes, Thomas Aquinas, 13th century Dominican friar, taught that God has the explanation for himself, within himself, and this has important consequences. As I said in my previous talk, if you can watch this on YouTube, but I think there's only 5 viewers on that so far, so you can look on that and increase it to 6. A talk called Aquinas and Agnosticism. I spoke about a man called David Burrell, who's a Thomist scholar, someone who studies Thomas. He gave an agnostic view of Aquinas, and he tried to say in one of his books that because God's nature cannot be known, neither can the nature of anything be known, which is logical on those premises. But in my last talk, I argued that Aquinas himself says the exact opposite. in his commentary on the divine names, Aquinas says that it is only because God exists and that God is super intelligible to himself, maybe not to us, but he is intelligible to himself. Therefore, anything in nature is intelligible. It's only because God is known to himself that anything in nature is knowable in principle. So God provides the metaphysical foundation for knowledge and for science to exist. On atheism, as we have seen, there is no reason. It's hanging in midair with no foundation. So it is no accident, in my view, it is no accident that modern science emerged when it did and where it did in the 17th century in England with the Royal Society, men like Francis Bacon, men like Boyle, who were Anglicans, Kepler, who was Lutheran, believed in a reasonable God. All these early pioneers, Galileo, who wasn't in England obviously, but these early pioneers of modern science, Newton, believed in a reasonable God, and therefore this is no coincidence. They believed in a reasonable God, and therefore they expected to find evidence of reason in nature. And of course, that's what they found. With on a different set of presuppositions, why bother? That faith was necessary to their method. Kepler said, "We are thinking God's thoughts after him." Galileo, in spite of his fight with the Pope, and the Pope really was following Aristotle rather than the Bible in saying that the Earth was the center of the universe, Galileo disproved him, but Galileo was not a skeptic. Galileo said, God is known by nature in his works and by doctrine in his revealed word. God is known by nature in his works. So creation, nature reveals God. God is knowable and nature is knowable because behind it is a super intelligible God who is known to himself. And so we return to John chapter 1, verse 1, the rational and intelligible truth. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The word for word is the Greek logos, reason or explanation. But moving beyond this, the mere Greek conception of logos, John tells us that this word became flesh, something inconceivable for the Greek mind. This word became flesh in space and time and dwelt amongst us in the person of Jesus of Nazareth. This one who took on flesh was the same one who was with God in the beginning and was God in the beginning. Later on in the chapter, verse 18, in the New American Standard Bible, it says these words, "No one has seen God at any time, but the only begotten God, who is in the bosom of the Father, he has explained him." I like that word, he has explained him. So God in Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, explains himself. Have a self-explanatory reason at the beginning of reality. I made the decision to receive Jesus Christ into my life when I was 12 years old through the witness of my Methodist Sunday school teacher, who I'm very grateful to God for. He told me from the Bible, showed me from the Bible how Jesus died for my sins on the cross and rose again from the dead. He showed me how the Bible is a book of answers to the big questions in life. When I prayed a simple prayer and received Christ into my life, I experienced a new birth, which changed the direction of my life from that day until today. I'd like to invite you as viewers to make that step of faith on the reasonableness of the Christian position. Ask the Lord Jesus Christ into your life and to explain God to you, to explain the Father to you. And I believe you will find in him the true meaning and the reason for life. There's a promise, again in the same chapter of John chapter 1, verse 11 to 13. He came to that which was his own, but his own did not receive him. Yet to all who did receive him, to those who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God, children born not of natural descent, nor of human decision or a husband's will, but born of God. Thank you for listening. I will now attempt to respond to any questions and comments from our viewers. Let me just see what's coming through here. Someone said, please try that song again, but with more grit in your throat. Okay, maybe next time I'll do that. Viewer comment, I believe that there is a God, a creator of this place in which we exist, a designer of the principles that guide our physical and spiritual being. However, I'm not convinced that this automatically means that any one of us, nor any one group of us, knows everything, or even many things, about this creator in full accuracy. Not that any one group of us is right about all or even many things. I would agree with that. Yes, only God fully knows God. God is super intelligible to himself. So we only have what is revealed to us, and as the Apostle Paul says, we see through a glass darkly. We know in part, we prophesy in part. When we die, then we will know fully as we are fully known. But Jesus Christ explains the Father, and so the fullness of God is seen in the person of Jesus, historical person of Jesus, who is alive today, and reveals himself to us through his Spirit in the Word. Another comment is, Alan, I admire how deeply you think through what you believe and how thorough you are on your show. Thanks for representing in many ways my view on this network. Appreciate that. Thank you very much for those kind words. Viewer, another comment, do I have to accept Jesus into my life to be loved by God? No, God's grace is unconditional. God's love is unconditional, and it says that we love him because he first loved us, not that he loves us because we first loved him. Those are all the comments so far. Please keep texting them in while I tell you what's coming up next. Next week we have the fantastic Daniel Vecchio in again. I hope you enjoyed him last week. I really enjoyed him. A great mind and great communicator. I've asked him to host the show next week because I'm going to be away. I can't be with you. I've asked him to host the show, and he's hoping to get a guest of his own in to interview. But if he fails to do that, then he's interested in speaking about the ontological argument. The ontological argument is one that many people have just dismissed. Have thought that Kant and Hume wrote it off centuries ago. But it has had something of a revival in the last century. And Daniel will be, if he doesn't get a guest, will be putting forth a defense of the ontological argument and saying some points about that which should be helpful in our thinking. So please tune into that. Either watch it at the same time next week, or you can watch it on YouTube. His previous talk is also on YouTube. Coming up also in future programs, on the 17th of February, we will be tackling the puzzle of evil. I'm hoping to be interviewed by my good friend Mike Cope from Woking, who interviewed me in a format called Sacred Space. That's a group that meets in Woking on this topic before. So I've asked him to interview me again. because that was a really good evening in Woking in Surrey. And the week after that, we have Duncan Miller. Duncan Miller was one of the original founders of the Good Reasons to Believe course in Nottingham in 2009. And I've heard Duncan many times. In fact, I heard him this week speak on this topic of the origin of life. He's a very good communicator, and it's a powerful argument for the existence of God. That's the 24th of February. Hoping to get some video on that. So it'll be hopefully a little bit different than just a talking head that we normally have. March the 3rd, I'm hoping to have a guest talking about Eastern thought. Eastern thought is very popular today, so we'll be looking at that. Has anything else come through yet? I don't think so. So, thank you very much for listening. I'm going to hand over to our producer, who will play some blues or some other groovy music, maybe some Louis Armstrong. So, thank you, Joey.